we're going to be looking at today is we're going to be looking at how to understand essay questions, particularly how you understand them and then go about answering them. Now, the kinds of questions you'll be getting in essays are generally going to be interpretive questions. The idea is that you're interpreting the question and you're interpreting the ideas that come in your response. The way that you answer this question is entirely up to you, provided, of course, that you use discussion, you link it with evidence, and you do it in such a way that what you're writing is you're composing a complete answer which is backed up but is mostly your own interpretation and your own way of looking at things. First of all, let's just start with the basics. It should be your first step of responding to a question. So before you actually start writing, make sure you really do understand the question. Literally, the biggest thing that come across in marking and the worst thing that you can do is just interpret a question incorrectly. That's what often where the worst marks come, is just from students who misinterpret the question. So it's something you really don't want to be doing. When I say misinterpret the question, you may interpret the question but not still fully get what exactly it is it's asking you to do. Because if you fully answer a question, you should get full marks, technically speaking, provided that everything's technically sound, and that you've constructed a convincing argument, and that you've gone into the required depth of discussion and so forth. Having a correct interpretation of the question is the only way to be able to do that. We'll go through an example. It will cost you more marks than anything. This is something that a lot of students complain about when they get their marks back, is why did I get such a low mark when I put so much effort into it? Well, you're not being marked on effort. You're being marked on how well you interpret the question. We'll go through the best way you can go understand every question that you come across. And this is the most important thing, is looking at the best way to answer it. Now, the best way isn't necessarily the best answer. The best way is to find the right process and the right plan to be able to organize your response effectively. Okay, so we're going to look at the question as we go, as I said. The question is, discuss how the theme of duality is represented in Droog's The New Frontiers. Now, without going through what actually the text is or anything else like that, all we need to do at this point is look at how you would interpret this question and how you would go about constructing your answer. First thing you should really try and do is break this up into pieces and work out exactly, as I said, what each of these words is trying to get you to do in the answer. I'm going to highlight as we go and look at the different parts of the question that you'll be looking at. And this is the thing that will come up when you're thinking about how you can compose your answer, is working on what of these keywords is telling you to do what. Okay, so first one is this keyword discuss to the left there. It's the first place you look, and the reason why is because a discussion question is very different from one asking you to argue. So immediately it's instructing you to how you should be answering the question. As in, the discussion question will ask you to just create a balanced sort of interpretation and construct an argument that way. Whereas an argument as such, or as that keyword suggests, is asking you to come up with a one-sided interpretation that is completely airtight and is dismissive of the other side. Although it may acknowledge points which are true. If you do debating, then that's one of the things you'd be looking at. Your answer to them both naturally will be quite different. Immediately, if you just don't look at that word, and it's often one that's very, very easy to overlook because you're so interested in the meat of the question, then you could be completely answering it the wrong way. This keyword is essentially something that should define what it is your answer should be doing. Now, there are more than just these two. You can come across a number of different ones. You might be asked to evaluate, you might be asked to identify, you might be asked to do a number of different things. So really, when you look at it, think very, very carefully about what that keyword means and what exactly it is asking you to do, because it will mean a difference between you directly interpreting what is required, you putting down an answer which is not quite what your marker is looking for. Now, the next thing we're going to be looking at is the WWH, which is a little bit different from the 5 W's and H, because mainly in essays you'll be only looking at the what, why, and how. Yes, sure, in other comprehension style questions you'll be looking at things like when, where, and to who. But in this case, you'll be mainly looking at the what, why, and hows. And these are aspects that need to be interpreted differently. For instance, why is it that something might occur? Have a look at a text and ask that question why. It might be what. So what is in a text and what does it do? Or it might be a how in this case. So I'll explain each of them a little bit more depth and go into examples. So a why question might be asking you to challenge and critique something in the text and give your own interpretation about why it is done such a way. A what question is asking you to identify something in the text, develop that identification, really work out what it is it's trying to do, particularly is if you're talking about a theme. In this case, we're talking about a theme in a different way, as in how do we get from the idea of druids and new frontiers to this idea of duality. Now, for those who don't know what duality is as a theme, and it's one that comes up frequently in Shakespearean plays, it's the conflict between good and evil, or light and dark. Essentially what the question is asking there is, discuss how light and dark is represented in this story. This is what we're looking at, is how do we connect the story to that idea of light and dark being shown in that story. Now, next thing we'll look at is the subject. Your subject and stimulus is where your evidence and where your ideas will be based on. However, will not form your discussion. Your question is not asking you in this case to discuss the story. It's asking you to discuss that idea. In other words, your discussion will not be a retelling of the story of the new frontiers. And that's a very important point to make, because in your answer, the temptation would be to just list lots of different times in the story where the theme of duality is represented, but not really to discuss them. Your evidence will be this, but your discussion will be focused on that idea of duality and its representation, and not necessarily on the text itself. Sure, your text will be an important part of how you answer it, and certainly, as I said before, they will form the basis of your ideas. It's not something that will define exactly what is right and what is wrong in the story, because it's up to your interpretation. So your interpretation will make up the discussion. This will often be your stimulus or prescribed text. So your stimulus or your subject will be something that you'll be referring to, which you will understand. So you need to know a bit about your stimulus or your prescribed text, obviously, in order to answer it. So in this case, you would hopefully know some things about the story in order to be able to answer the question. Now, the final part, and probably the most important bit, is that bit highlighted now. The theme of duality is represented by. So this is, as I said, the key section of the question. And this is what your discussion is effectively trying to prove. So this is the part you'll be mainly focusing on. That the theme of duality is represented in the text. Now, that might seem obvious, but obviously you're focusing now would be on trying to prove that, rather than tell me different things about that story. So as a marker, I'm more worried about you trying to prove that. I don't really care if you know the story or not. The only way you can prove to me you know the story is by providing the right sort of evidence which backs up your points, and coming up with some very good examples of things which help to prove your idea. Discussing it in isolation is obviously a bad idea as well. You need to have the evidence there, but it should be your main priority. Your discussion should reflect theme duality, representation of text. Your quotes will be your evidence to prove that. Essentially what we've got here is we've got your idea, your interpretation, all the aspects of your interpretation, so as in your reasons for it, your way of looking at how it's conveyed, and then you would use the text finally as a way to prove how it's conveyed and how it's shown, that key word there, represented. Now, your quotes need to have relevance. You need to pick something that's going to actually mean something. Be linked from your discussion straight back to the question. Immediately, you go from your quotes or your evidence, you develop your discussion, and then the final step is to make sure that it goes back to the question again. And if it doesn't, make sure it does. Put a line at the end of the paragraph which puts everything you've just written and go straight towards that idea of looking at the question, because that is the main part of what it is you need to do. So now that we've understood the question and we know exactly what it is we need to do, where do we go? From your answers, you should be focusing on developing some ideas which reflect how you've interpreted the question, how you've identified what is a part of the question. You should also work on developing your main points as such that relies on making a number of strong links between the subject and the topic of the question. You've got an idea now of what it is I exactly need to do. I need to find things that are connecting this idea of duality to the text and how it's represented. I'm immediately now trying to find some links, and I would try and find multiple links between that idea, what it does, relate it straight back to the question, and not focus on anything else which might be irrelevant to that. Now, as it is a discussion, you don't have to try and necessarily convince someone that the text has an element of duality to it. It's accepted that it does. So what you need to do then is you need to make sure that through your discussion that you prove that A equals B. And that's all you need to do. Same as when you're trying to do that in algebra or something equivalent in maths, is you're trying to prove that your answer is correct. And it's the same with English. Really, that's all you need to do. Remember, when you're answering a question, break it down into keywords, find the key parts of it, Look for the things that you can analyze as part of the question and look at how these form the basis of your main ideas and choose them very, very carefully to make sure that your main points address what it is you've identified in the question. Have a very careful look at it. Use your reading time if you're doing an exam. Otherwise, just read the question multiple times, highlight different aspects of the question, highlight those key words, and you will find yourself with a good guide to what it is you need to do in your answer. And that's about all there is to understanding the question. So make sure that you take your time, look at it carefully, follow the steps that I've outlined here, and you'll do fine. Until next time, I'll see you later.